In the mist-veiled streets of Bath, a promise dies with an old man's final breath, and a young woman's future shatters. Genevieve Merriweather, stripped of dowry and protection, stands at the edge of ruin when a silent, formidable Marquess extends an unexpected lifeline. Within the austere halls of Stanwyck House, glances burn, rumours sharpen, and a locked door hums with a truth no one dares name. Is salvation an act of duty, or the spark of a forbidden desire? When honor collides with longing, one choice can rewrite a life. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and share. What do you love most about historical romances? The yearning, the secrets, or the impossible, irresistible choice? Bath, England, in the year 1857. The winter air clung to the stone facades of the crescent terraces, a veil of mist drifting from the Avon and softening the spires of the Abbey. Carriages moved like dark silhouettes through the narrow streets, their wheels muffled by damp cobblestones. It was a city of elegant promenades and whispered reputations, where every glance held meaning and every rumour could alter a life. In the modest drawing-room off Great Pulteney Street, Genevieve Merriweather sat rigidly on a damask chair, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the seams bit into her fingers. The fire in the grate had burned low, casting a pallor over her ivory skin. News of Lord Algernon Locksley's sudden death had arrived not an hour before. He had been elderly, a man she barely knew beyond the formal dinners and measured letters arranged by her convent guardians. Yet his name had been her last fragile anchor in society. Now, even that had vanished. Around her, the muted chatter of the Locksley household staff seeped beneath the door. They spoke her name with sympathy, but also with curiosity, as though she were a strange relic left behind after a storm. Without a dowry, without a family, without a protector, she had become, at 24, an object of pity and speculation. The thought of returning to the convent, where the scent of beeswax and old prayers still lingered in her mind, filled her with a quiet despair. A soft knock broke the silence. A footman entered, his expression rehearsed in courtesy. "The Marquess of Stanwyck is here, Miss Merriweather. He requests a word with you." The name sent a ripple through her chest. Julian Harwood, Marquess of Stanwyck, godson to Lord Locksley, known in Bath for his reserve and for the scandal that had once surrounded his family. She rose slowly, smoothing the folds of her dove-blue wool dress, its high neckline buttoned to the throat, a lace fichu tucked neatly into her bodice. Her bonnet lay on the table, ribbons trailing like sighs. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, hazel eyes wide, lips pale but steady, and willed her composure to hold. He awaited her in the adjoining parlour, framed by the tall windows where fog clung to the glass. Julian Harwood stood with his back partially turned, a tall figure in a charcoal frock coat tailored to his broad shoulders, a dark waistcoat embroidered in subtle green, and a black cravat tied with precise austerity. His steel-blue eyes lifted as she entered, cool and observant, like a man accustomed to weighing every word before he spoke it. "Miss Merriweather," he said at last, his voice a deep, restrained timbre, "I am grieved that we meet under such circumstances." His tone was formal, yet there was a flicker, an almost imperceptible warmth, in his gaze. Genevieve lowered her head in a graceful curtsy, feeling the weight of the moment press upon her. "My lord," she murmured, "your presence is a kindness." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Outside, a carriage rolled past, its wheels crunching over gravel. The scent of damp stone and faded roses drifted in through a slight crack in the window. Genevieve felt the hush between them thrum with unspoken judgments, the impropriety of her position, the suspicion that would follow her wherever she went. Julian stepped closer, but not too close, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. "Lord Locksley entrusted me with certain responsibilities," he began. "It would dishonour his memory to leave you without protection. If you wish, I will provide you temporary accommodation at Stanwyck House until other arrangements can be made." The words fell with the weight of duty, not affection. Yet beneath them, Genevieve sensed a complicated current, something steadier than pity but far colder than sympathy. Her pulse quickened despite herself. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes fully. "You are generous, my lord, but I would not have Bath think—" He interrupted softly, a hint of steel threading through his voice. "Let Bath think what it will. You will not be left to whispers and doorsteps." His certainty startled her. She had imagined a perfunctory meeting, perhaps a polite dismissal. Instead, here stood a man who embodied the very world that had cast her aside, offering her a place within it, even if only as an obligation. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks and lowered her gaze to the patterned rug. "I understand," she said after a pause. "I will go." Julian inclined his head, the movement precise, but his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than courtesy required. "A carriage will call for you in the morning," he said. "Pack lightly." Then, almost as an afterthought, his voice softened. "You are not alone, Miss Merriweather, though it may feel otherwise." He left the parlour with long, deliberate strides, his dark coat billowing slightly at his heels. The door closed with a muted click, leaving Genevieve in the echo of his presence. She stood perfectly still, her fingers trembling against the smooth surface of the mantel. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the outline of the city beyond the window, as though Bath itself held its breath. In that suspended moment, she felt the weight of every expectation pressing upon her, yet also a strange flicker, something neither hope nor dread, but the sharp awareness that her life had shifted, and nothing would ever be quite as it had been. The carriage wheels groaned as they climbed the winding drive, flanked on either side by rows of ancient yew trees whose blackened branches clawed toward the grey sky. Dawn had not yet broken fully, and the frost-laced countryside lay beneath a pale shroud of mist, as though the earth itself resisted awakening. Genevieve Merriweather sat motionless, gloved hands folded tightly on her lap, her gaze fixed on the looming silhouette of the estate that emerged through the fog like a relic from another age. Stanwix House. Its stone facade bore the marks of time and solemnity, ivy crawling like veins across the high, stern walls. The windows, tall and narrow, reflected nothing of warmth. The arched entrance stood heavy and uninviting, its iron lanterns unlit, its threshold wide enough to swallow a life whole. Genevieve's heart pounded not with fear, but with the dreadful stillness that follows a fall. She had stepped into the unknown. She had stepped into his world. The carriage halted. A footman appeared wordlessly, opening the door with a bow that was more perfunctory than welcoming. She descended with careful grace, the hem of her dove-blue skirt gathering a trace of dew as it brushed the damp stone. No greeting awaited her. No lady of the house stood at the steps to receive her. No chaperone to lend decorum to her presence. She was alone, and yet, behind one of those darkened windows, she sensed his eyes. The housekeeper, a stiff woman with a severe part in her greying hair and a starched apron that mirrored her expression, led her through the entry hall without ceremony. The interior of Stanwix was grand, but not ostentatious. Wood-panelled walls bore portraits of long-dead Harwoods with penetrating gazes and powdered wigs. The scent of beeswax polish and stone lingered in the air, mingling with the faintest trace of fading roses, something ghostly, something forgotten. "You will be staying in the East Wing," the housekeeper said curtly, her eyes avoiding Genevieve's face. "Meals will be taken in your chamber unless summoned." "His lordship does not keep a regular schedule." Genevieve nodded with quiet composure. She expected nothing more. Her room, though modest, bore the marks of good breeding. A carved four-poster bed dressed in linen and wool, a small writing desk with inkwell and blotting paper, a fireplace not yet lit. Heavy velvet drapes framed a narrow window that looked onto a courtyard of bare trees and silent stone. There was no mirror. She unpacked in silence. A book, a brush, her few garments carefully folded. Her mourning bonnet she placed in the wardrobe, out of sight. Her hair she pinned with habitual care. The chestnut waves swept back into a low chignon. She was no longer a ward of the convent, nor a bride-to-be. She was a guest in a house where she had no rightful place. The days passed in hushes and glances. She rarely saw anyone but the maid who brought her breakfast on a tray of polished silver, eyes lowered, mouth tight. The walls of Stanwick held their breath, their corridors echoing with footsteps that never reached her door. In the evenings, she read by the hearth, the pages trembling in her hands more from the solitude than the cold. She did not seek Julian Harwood, nor did he summon her, but he was there. She felt him in the stillness of the stairwell, where once she descended and heard the creak of a boot behind her. She caught the scent of his cologne, cedar and leather, in the library where she had paused to replace a book. She glimpsed the silhouette of his form at the far end of the hallway as he turned the corner, tall and composed, disappearing like a thought unspoken. It was on the 5th morning that she dared to step beyond the east wing, drawn by the faint melody of a piano echoing through the west corridor. The notes were somber, hesitant, like a memory being summoned from beneath the dust. She followed the sound, her slippers nearly silent on the rugs, until it ceased abruptly, and there he was. Julian Harwood stood beside the closed lid of the pianoforte, one hand resting on its lacquered surface, the other curled around a letter. His back was to her, his shoulders taut beneath the dark wool of his coat. He did not turn. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and clipped. "I was following the music," she replied, more gently than boldly. He turned then. His eyes met hers with sharp precision, but no anger, only caution. "That room," he said, nodding to a door down the hall, "is not to be entered, ever." There was something in his tone, something final. The door in question was unremarkable, painted the same ivory as the others, but the air near it felt colder. She did not ask why. She did not need to. Some grief was better left undisturbed. "I understand," she said simply. A silence bloomed between them. He did not move, nor did she. The morning light filtered through the tall window beside them, casting lines of brightness and shadow across the corridor floor. It danced over the embroidery on her sleeve, caught in the gold flecks of her hazel eyes. She felt his gaze rest there, then shift, downward, as though he could not bear to meet her expression too long. "I trust the room is adequate," he said finally. "It is more than adequate, my lord." He inclined his head. The conversation, if it could be called such, was over. He left her there without another word, footsteps fading, and she returned to her room with a heart that beat far louder than reason permitted. From that day forward, she sensed something shifting. He still kept his distance, but there were moments, fleeting and unclaimed, when their paths crossed unexpectedly. Once she entered the library to find him seated by the fire reading. He looked up, and their eyes locked for a breath. He said nothing, she said nothing, but neither of them looked away. Another time, in the conservatory, she reached for a sprig of lavender, and his hand brushed hers. The contact was accidental, no more than a second, but it left her skin tingling long after he had retreated into the shadow of the corridor. The servants noticed. Whispers began to circle, soft as lace, sharp as needles. The housekeeper passed her with narrowed eyes. The maid who brought her meals no longer lingered. She heard the words, improper, unchaperoned, sheltered, spoken behind hands and in corners, but Genevieve, raised among whispers, had learned long ago how to walk through them without letting them cling. Still, in the quiet of night, she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A guest, a responsibility, a mistake, or something else. It was on the 7th evening that she found herself once more in the corridor near the forbidden room. The house was silent, save for the tick of the long-case clock in the foyer and the occasional groan of the wind pressing against the windows. She stood before the door, not out of defiance, but drawn by a feeling she could not name. Behind her, a presence stirred. "You still wonder," he said, his voice a breath behind her. She turned. He was there, only a pace away. His gaze held hers, not cold this time, but searching. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the aching proximity. "I respect what is not mine to know," she whispered. A flicker crossed his features, pain, perhaps, or gratitude, or both. He stepped back, as though the moment had neared too much truth. "Good night, Miss Merriweather," he said quietly, and then he was gone again. She returned to her room with the echo of his voice like velvet in her mind. She did not know what game fate played by placing her in this house of silences and shadows, under the watch of a man who offered shelter but withheld himself. But in the deep stillness of her heart, a seed had been planted, not of hope, not yet, but of awareness. Something had begun, something neither of them could yet name. The snow had come suddenly, as if summoned by some unseen hand determined to trap time in silence. By the second day of its steady descent, Stanwick House stood wrapped in a pale hush, its rooftops burdened by soft weight, its windows glazed with frost. The countryside beyond was lost beneath a sea of white, and the trees in the orchard bowed beneath crystal veils. No carriages stirred, no visitors arrived, and the world, once bustling in soft winter murmurs, had vanished into stillness. Genevieve watched from her window, her breath clouding the glass. A single flake drifted past, slow and aimless, until it vanished against the frozen sill. Her fingers curled around the curtain's edge. The hours had grown longer, heavier, and though the warmth of the fire kept her limbs from trembling, it did nothing to still the quiet ache growing in her chest. The house had turned inward, and so had she. By the afternoon, unable to bear the confines of her room a moment longer, Genevieve wrapped herself in her thickest shawl, slipped on her gloves, and stepped into the corridor. The hall was dim, lit only by the orange flicker of distant wall sconces. The silence was almost sacred, broken only by the faint creak of her steps across the wooden floor. She wandered as if under a spell, passing the portrait gallery, the morning room, the tall windows of the library now blurred with frost. Then as she turned down a hallway she rarely walked, she saw it, light spilling from a narrow door, left ajar. A draught kissed her cheek, cold and whispering, and instinct guided her hand toward it. It was the conservatory, a long glass chamber, attached to the rear of the house. It stretched out like a crystal spine into the garden. Snow had pressed itself against every pane, muting the world into whiteness. Yet inside, the winter garden lived on. Evergreen shrubs, skeletal vines, and dormant rose bushes filled raised beds bordered by iron trellises. A marble bench rested near the center beneath a fig tree now bare of leaves. And there, with a book forgotten on the bench beside him, stood Julian Harwood. He did not turn when she entered, though she knew he had sensed her. He wore no coat, only a black waistcoat over his white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the strength of his forearms and the faint trace of veins along his wrists. His hair, slightly disheveled, caught the light like shadowed bronze. His eyes, fixed on something beyond the glass, were unreadable. She stepped closer, slow and uncertain, until her voice found her. "I hope I do not intrude." He turned then. His gaze swept over her, not with impatience, but with the quiet calculation of a man startled by his own thoughts. "No," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You do not." She hesitated, then moved toward the bench, lowering herself onto it with care. The cold of the marble seeped through her skirts. Julian remained standing, only a few paces away. "It's beautiful," she said softly, looking at the snow-covered hedges beyond the glass. "Even in its sleep." "Especially in its sleep," he replied, eyes still distant, "when it hides its wounds beneath the frost." His words struck something in her, deep and unspoken. She glanced at him, his silhouette framed by the garden's hush, and saw not only a man, but a sorrow made flesh. "I wonder," she said after a moment, "what wounds you've chosen to hide." He stiffened, just barely, but enough for her to feel it in the air between them. His gaze met hers again, sharper now, as if she had trespassed. But she did not withdraw. "I mean no harm," she said gently. "Only, you are always here, yet never truly present. And She faltered, then straightened her spine. "I would rather know pain than remain forever untouched." His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with a kind of recognition. A storm passed behind them, one she could not yet name. He walked to the bench and sat beside her, not touching, not even close, but near enough for his presence to fill the air between them. "I once believed I understood loyalty," he said slowly, his voice low and roughened by memory, "that it meant doing what was expected, what was proper. I was engaged years ago, a connection of two families, long arranged. We were young. I did not love her, but I respected her, and I thought that would be enough." Genevieve listened in stillness, her breath shallow. "She fell in love with someone else," he continued, "someone beneath her station. I discovered it only weeks before the wedding. Rather than confront her, I confronted the man, my own brother." She turned sharply. He nodded. "He denied it, of course. I believed him. I forced her hand. She went through with the ceremony. 3 months later, she vanished. Left a note. Left everything. The scandal nearly destroyed both families. My brother took his life the following spring." A silence fell so deep, it seemed the garden had stopped breathing. Genevieve closed her eyes briefly, a wave of sorrow rushing through her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Julian's hands were clasped between his knees. He stared at the floor. "I was not innocent in it. I was proud, blind. I thought duty outweighed heart, and I lost them both." He rose then, as if the weight of his confession had made the air too heavy to sit beneath. "I don't allow myself to get close, Miss Merriweather, because when I do, I destroy what I touch." She stood too, facing him. The space between them felt like a line drawn in frost, fragile, dangerous, easily broken. "You did not destroy me," she said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "You offered me shelter when no one else would. I did so out of obligation." "No," she said, taking one step closer. "You did so because you could not bear to see me cast aside. You may deny it, but I know compassion when I feel it." Their eyes locked, and in that suspended breath, something shifted. His hand lifted, slowly, as if moved by instinct more than thought. Her breath caught. His fingers reached toward her cheek, hovering. But before he could touch her, he recoiled as if burned. "I can't," he whispered. She said nothing. Her skin still trembled where his hand had almost been. The distance between them returned like a gate slamming shut. "I should not have spoken," he said, stepping back. "Forgive me." Without another word, he turned and walked swiftly from the conservatory, his footsteps lost to the hush of falling snow. Genevieve stood alone among the sleeping vines, the cold pressing in around her, not from the weather, but from the ache he had left behind. She did not cry, but her heart pulsed with a longing so sharp it cut through every layer of restraint, not because she had been denied, but because for one moment she had been seen. And now she could not forget it. Bath in the early weeks of February had donned a different face. The snow had thinned into damp mist, the streets slick with melting frost, yet the chill of gossip remained sharper than any winter wind. Within the drawing rooms and tea houses, in the echoing arcades of the pump room, the name Genevieve Merriweather began to drift like perfume and poison alike. She was called a ward, a guest, a dependent. Some, lowering their voices with delicious malice, dared the word mistress. Others added no word at all, only a lifted brow and a knowing glance. Genevieve herself heard none of it directly, but she felt the weight of it as she walked through the echoing corridors of Stanwick House. The servants no longer masked their curiosity. Their curtsies and bows had grown shallower, their eyes less soft. Even the maid who brought her tea in the mornings had begun to linger at the threshold, lips pressed tight as though holding back questions. The air had shifted, acquiring the faint taste of judgment. She bore it with the composure of one who had learned long ago that dignity was a shield no whisper could pierce. Yet the murmur of voices beyond closed doors, the sudden silence when she entered a room, left a tremor beneath her calm. It was not merely impropriety, it was the peril of a woman without a place, caught between the world of servants and the world of gentry belonging to neither. On a morning heavy with drizzle, Genevieve sat near the tall window of the East Wing's parlour, her sewing basket in her lap. Outside, the gardens lay sodden and grey, stripped of their snowy veil. She stitched with deliberate care, each pull of the thread an attempt to quiet the thoughts that had begun to whirl since the storm. She had scarcely slept since the encounter in the conservatory. The click of boot heels announced the arrival of someone before she could compose herself. The door opened and a scent of violets drifted in. Violets and something sharper. A young woman swept into the room, tall and slender, her russet hair arranged in gleaming coils beneath a feathered hat. Her travelling cloak was of dark plum velvet lined with sable, and her gloved hands gripped a muff of fine fur. Her expression bore the polished smile of a blade. "Ah," she said brightly, though her tone carried frost. "You must be Miss Merriweather. How quaint." Genevieve rose, setting aside her work, and dipped a respectful curtsy. "Good morning. You are—" "Clarissa Ellingham," the young woman replied, tilting her head slightly. "Julian's cousin, though I suppose you know him as the Marquess of Stanwick." She let the title linger as though polishing it. Genevieve inclined her head. "It is a pleasure, Miss Ellingham." Clarissa's eyes travelled over her, cataloguing every detail from the modest dove-grey gown to the simple fichu at her throat. A flicker of something, triumph or pity, crossed her face. "Is it?" she murmured. "I wonder." She removed her gloves with languid precision, laying them across the back of a chair, and began to wander the parlour as though it were a gallery. "My cousin is very generous, isn't he?" she said lightly. "Always taking in strays." Genevieve stiffened but did not speak. Clarissa turned, her smile widening. "Oh, forgive me. That must sound dreadful. But you see, Julian has obligations, real ones. The family expects him to marry well, to restore what scandal has eroded. He cannot afford—" She let her words trail off, eyes narrowing faintly, to be distracted. Genevieve folded her hands before her, her voice calm. "I would not presume to interfere with his obligations. Wouldn't you?" Clarissa's tone was velvet on glass. "Bath is buzzing with speculation. And speculation, Miss Merriweather, is a fire easily fed and difficult to extinguish." Before Genevieve could reply, the door opened again. Julian entered, tall and immovable, his dark coat damp from the mist outside. His eyes moved first to Clarissa, then to Genevieve, and something like irritation flickered across his features. "Clarissa," he said, his voice cool but not unkind. "You might have written before descending upon my household." "I thought a surprise visit would be delightful," she replied, moving toward him with outstretched hands. "We have so much to discuss, cousin. I worry for you." Julian's gaze shifted to Genevieve briefly, and in that look she read both apology and warning. "There is no need to worry," he said. "Miss Merriweather is under my protection. You will treat her with respect while you are here." Clarissa's smile faltered. "Of course, I am always respectful." Yet her eyes slid to Genevieve with an unspoken challenge. Genevieve inclined her head politely, suppressing the heat rising in her chest. Julian's defense, brief as it was, felt like an anchor dropped in a churning sea. Clarissa moved closer to him. "We should speak privately. There are matters of importance, arrangements to be made. You cannot keep postponing." "Later," he said curtly. "For now, Miss Merriweather and I were engaged in no conversation you need interrupt." Clarissa blinked at the rebuke, then recovered with a graceful laugh. "Very well. I shall retire to my room and wait. I'm sure we will have ample time to catch up." She swept from the parlour like a storm cloud, trimmed in velvet. The door closed. The room seemed to exhale. Genevieve kept her eyes on her hands, but she felt Julian's presence shift. He stood near the window, looking out at the sodden garden, his profile carved with restraint. "You need not defend me," she said quietly. His voice was even. "I did not defend you. I defended what is decent." Her heart gave a small, inexplicable ache. "And yet Bath will talk. Let it." He turned then, his eyes on her with a force that pinned her to the spot. "Let it." He left before she could answer, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Genevieve sat slowly, the sewing forgotten on the table. Her pulse throbbed at her throat. Clarissa's words had been sharp, but Julian's look, steady, unflinching, had unsettled her far more. Later that afternoon, a knock at her chamber door drew her from her reverie. The maid entered with a silver tray, upon which lay a single envelope, sealed with green wax, stamped with a crest she did not recognize. "A letter for you, miss," the maid said, her tone clipped. It came with the London post. When the door closed again, Genevieve took the envelope with trembling fingers. The seal was unbroken, the wax cool beneath her thumb. She recognized the handwriting at once, precise yet elegant. Lady Tamsin Fairley. Her father had spoken of the Fairley name once, long ago, in a moment she had half forgotten. A story of old debts, of kindness rendered and never repaid. The memory flickered like a candle in a draught. She broke the seal. The scent of pressed lavender rose faintly from the paper. "My dear Miss Merryweather, I write to you not as a stranger, but as a friend to your late father. The time has come for certain truths to be restored to their rightful place. I cannot speak of them in a letter. Should you find yourself in London, my door will be open to you. Yours in friendship, Tamsin Fairley." Genevieve read it twice, her heart quickening. The words were courteous, yet beneath them pulsed an urgency she could not name. Certain truths. Restored. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her palm as though it might yield warmth. Through the window the sky had darkened to pewter, and the gardens lay like a map of secrets waiting to be uncovered. In the hall beyond her door, voices rose, Clarissa's lilting tone, Julian's measured replies. The sound drifted like distant thunder, then faded. Genevieve turned back to the window, the letter still in her hand. The mist was rising again from the fields, cloaking Stannick House in a soft grey veil. Yet for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a flicker of something not despair, not even hope, but curiosity, sharp and insistent as a key against a lock. And in that moment she understood that the whispers in Bath were nothing compared to the whispers in this house, and that some warnings arrived not as threats, but as invitations. The fire in the library crackled with a subdued intensity, casting long, flickering shadows over the rows of shelved books and the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the night. Outside, Bath lay wrapped in fog, the city quiet beneath the hush of an early spring that had not yet arrived. The air smelled of aged parchment and cedar smoke, tinged faintly with the perfume of wilted roses left in a crystal vase upon the mantel. Genevieve sat near the hearth, a book open on her lap, though she had long ceased to read. Her fingers rested lightly on the pages, her gaze wandering to the flames that danced with a quiet rhythm. Across the room, Julian stood by the decanter, his tall frame half illuminated by the firelight, his expression unreadable. He poured a measure of port into a glass, though he did not drink. The amber liquid glowed in the crystal like garnet, forgotten in his hand. His eyes were on her now, but distant, as if looking through her rather than at her. The silence between them had stretched long and delicate, not uncomfortable, but laced with a tension neither had named. They had spoken earlier, as they rarely did, of inconsequential things, of books, of the weather, of a piece of music she remembered from childhood. And then, without warning, he had told her of his mother. She hated the rain, he had said, standing near the window where the glass wept with mist. Said it made the world feel too honest. She preferred sun, even when it was cruel. Genevieve had not known what to say to that. She only nodded, the ache of something unspoken building in her throat. Now, as the hour edged toward midnight, she closed the book gently and rose, smoothing the skirts of her pale lavender gown. The lace at her collar trembled with her breath. "I should retire," she said, though her voice betrayed her reluctance. Julian looked at her then, truly looked. The line of his jaw was taut, his cravat slightly loosened, the dark waves of his hair more unruly than usual. In the firelight, his eyes had taken on a stormy hue, flecked with something she could not name. "I'll walk you to your chamber," he said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish." He offered no arm, nor did she expect it. They moved side by side through the corridor, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs, the silence growing louder with each step. The sconces cast golden halos on the panelled walls, and the scent of burning wood clung to the air like a memory. At the threshold of her room, she turned to face him. He remained a pace away, his posture composed, yet something restless stirred beneath his surface. "Thank you," she said, her hand resting on the doorknob. He said nothing for a moment, then, "Will you write to her?" She blinked, surprised. "To Lady Fairley?" He nodded once. "You should. I believe she would welcome it." "I intend to," Genevieve replied softly. I think she knew my father." Julian's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a breath. "He was a better man than I've allowed myself to remember." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. She stepped closer, only slightly, but enough for the distance between them to shift. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Why do you carry so much guilt, my lord?" He met her gaze with a force that took her breath. "Because some men carry swords, Miss Merriweather, and others carry their failures." The silence that followed felt like a cliff's edge. Her fingers trembled on the brass doorknob. "You are not the man you believe yourself to be." His breath caught. "No," he said hoarsely. "I'm worse." Their eyes locked. Something surged in the space between them, something fragile and ferocious. Her heart beat wildly in her chest. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the indecision carved into every line of his face. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of him, the scent of leather and smoke rising from his coat. His hand lifted, slowly, reverently. She felt the air shift, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. His fingers brushed the edge of her jaw, a feather-light touch that ignited something deep within her. Her breath caught, her eyes fluttered closed. But the kiss did not come. The touch vanished. Her lashes lifted. Julian had stepped back, his expression a storm of anguish and restraint. "I shouldn't," he said, the words more breath than sound. "Forgive me." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling with silent devastation. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came. He turned away from her and walked a few steps down the corridor, his back rigid. "I have made arrangements," he said without turning. "A carriage will take you to London the day after tomorrow. I've spoken with a friend there, a woman of standing. You will be welcomed." Genevieve could not move. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "You're sending me away," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "I'm giving you back your freedom," he replied. "You deserve more than whispers and doorways, Genevieve, more than what this house and my name can offer you. But I never asked for." "You didn't need to," he said, finally turning to face her. "I see it. Every day. You are growing smaller here, dimming, and I cannot," he faltered, his voice raw. "I cannot be the reason you disappear." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With careful precision, she drew her hand from the doorknob and folded it against her waist. "If that is truly what you believe," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "then I will go." They stood in silence, two souls on either side of an invisible chasm. The moment that had almost been was gone, carried away by duty, swallowed by fear. She entered her chamber without another word, closing the door gently behind her. Only then, in the privacy of the dim room, did she allow herself to press her palm to her chest, where the echo of his almost touch still lingered. Her breath came shallow and sharp, and her heart beat with the ache of what had been withheld. On the small writing table near the window lay the letter from Lady Fairley, its seal unbroken. She reached for it with trembling fingers, as though reaching for a future not yet written. She did not sleep that night, and when morning came, the mist did not lift. The carriage rolled through the narrow London streets beneath a sky heavy with soot and spring drizzle. Smoke curled from chimneys in crooked rows, mingling with the fog that pressed itself against the glass, blurring the tall townhouses into silhouettes. Genevieve sat rigidly in the corner seat, her gloved hands clasped atop her travelling reticule, the rhythm of the cobblestones pulsing beneath her like a second heartbeat. She had not looked back when the gates of Stanwix House disappeared into the morning mist, nor had she allowed herself to cry. Not when the footman placed her modest trunk atop the carriage, not when Julian's absence confirmed the finality of his decision. She had held herself together with a dignity carved from silence, the letter from Lady Tamsin Fairley tucked safely into the folds of her cloak. London was louder than she remembered, louder and less forgiving. The carriage halted before a narrow but elegant brick house on Bentinck Street, its windows framed with dark shutters, its iron railings sharp and pristine. A uniformed maid emerged at once, her expression efficient, but not unkind. Genevieve stepped down into the chill air, the hem of her travelling dress brushing against damp stone. A moment later, the door opened. Lady Tamsin Fairley stood in the threshold, framed by the golden glow of a hallway lamp. She was taller than Genevieve had imagined, her figure slender, her bearing regal without ostentation. Her hair, silver blonde and swept into an intricate twist, crowned a face lined not with age, but with intelligence. She wore a gown of dove-grey silk, trimmed in violet, and the glint of jet earrings caught the light as she extended her hand. "You have her eyes," she said gently, her voice warm and steady. "Edward's eyes. Come in, my dear. You are very welcome." Genevieve stepped forward as if into another life. That first night, the air between them was thick with memories not yet spoken. They dined in a small salon off the main hall, where a fire burned low and the scent of bay laurel lingered from the meal. Tamsin asked little and offered more, a room at the top of the house with a window that overlooked the rooftops of Marylebone. A lady's maid named Isabel, who pressed her gowns and brought her tea at sunrise. And most importantly, time. It was not until the third day that Tamsin spoke of Genevieve's father. "He saved my husband from ruin," she said, seated beneath the pale morning light filtering through the breakfast-room curtains, "and asked for nothing in return." Genevieve set down her teacup, her pulse quickening. "He never spoke of that to me, not in detail." Tamsin smiled faintly. That was Edward's way. He believed in honor the way others believe in heaven, quietly and without expecting it to be returned. A silence passed between them, full of things unsaid. "His name is not forgotten," Tamsin added, "nor is his daughter without allies." With that, something shifted. London, once a place of exile, began to unfold its corners to Genevieve. Tamsin introduced her not as a guest, nor as a girl in need, but as a young woman of remarkable learning and gentle breeding. A governess position was arranged within a week, temporary at first, for a baronet's daughters in Kensington. The girls were unruly and clever, but took to Genevieve with surprising affection. She earned her first sovereign with trembling fingers and wept quietly that night beside the fire, though she told no one. Within a month, word spread. Her French was impeccable, her handwriting elegant, her moral character unquestionable. Requests followed, 2 days a week in Bloomsbury, 1 in Mayfair. By the end of the season, she had 5 regular pupils and more offers than she could accept. Her income, though modest, was hers. Her clothing changed, not drastically, but deliberately. Tamsin insisted she accept a few gifts: a walking dress of navy wool with velvet cuffs, a reticule of beaded jet, a hat adorned with silk violets that suited the curve of her cheek. Genevieve began to move through the city with the quiet confidence of a woman who had chosen her path rather than been placed upon it. And yet, She carried him with her, not always at the surface, but always near. In the scent of leather-bound books in the library of a client's home, in the sound of a piano playing far off through an open window, in the echo of a voice on a foggy street that was not his, but close enough to make her heart stutter. His name surfaced now and then, like the ghost of a memory she refused to banish. A mention in the Bath columns, a donation to a local hospital, a brief attendance at a political dinner, a property purchased on the outskirts of the city. The Marquess of Stanwick, always formal, always distant, but there like a thread in the tapestry of her new life. She never asked, and no one told. It was on a rain-swept afternoon in April that Genevieve found herself invited to tea with a certain Lady Morton, a patroness of the arts and benefactress to the school where one of her pupils studied. The salon was well appointed, all gilt mirrors and velvet upholstery, filled with the scent of rosewater and painted conversation. "Miss Merriweather," Lady Morton declared, pouring her tea with theatrical flair, "your reputation is quite unblemished. Rare for a woman who arrives in London with no relations and no fortune." Genevieve smiled politely. "I consider myself fortunate in my friends, Lady Morton." "Indeed," the older woman replied, eyes narrowing. "It is whispered that you were once connected to a certain household in Somerset. A Marquess, I believe. A rather silent one." The words hung in the air like perfume gone sour. Genevieve's posture remained steady. "I was a guest for a time. The late Lord Loxley was a friend of my father." Lady Morton stirred her tea slowly. "And the current lord?" Genevieve met her gaze. "Is a man of honour, and nothing more." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The conversation drifted away, and Lady Morton seemed satisfied. But the ache in Genevieve's chest returned that night as she stood by the window of her chamber, watching the gaslights flicker below, like stars that had fallen to earth. She had chosen this life. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of disappointment and silence. She moved now in rooms of dignity, spoke with precision, earned her place. And yet, beneath the lace collars and the measured smiles, her heart kept time with a memory that refused to fade. Julian's voice, Julian's restraint, Julian's rejection, the almost kiss that lived in the hollow of her throat. On her writing desk lay a sealed envelope from Tamsin's solicitor regarding her father's estate, unremarkable, long settled, but beside it was another envelope, unmarked. Inside, a note in a hand she did not recognize. "He still walks the garden at night, alone." There was no name, no return address, only the faintest trace of lavender on the parchment. Genevieve folded the paper slowly, pressing it to her chest as the rain painted streaks on the window pane. London had awakened her, but her heart had never truly left Bath. Snowflakes spiraled from a pale grey sky as the carriage turned onto Ashcroft Square, the wheels cutting soft grooves into the powdered stone. The grand facade of Ashcroft House stood ablaze with light, each window casting warm golden rays onto the snow-blanketed lawn. Footmen in livery moved with solemn precision, escorting guests up the wide marble steps into the heart of London's winter season. Inside the carriage, Genevieve Merriweather sat still and composed, her gloved hands resting in her lap, her breath forming faint clouds in the chilled air. The interior lamps cast a soft glow over her features, delicate, serene, and changed. She wore a gown of deep plum velvet, the bodice fitted with pearl-trimmed seams, the skirt falling in fluid waves of richness around her. Her dark chestnut hair was swept into an elegant chignon, with a few artful tendrils framing her face. Around her neck hung a single-drop pearl on a fine chain, modest yet refined. She looked like a woman born to that world, and yet no part of her felt entirely safe within it. Lady Tamsin fairly sat beside her, resplendent in silver silk and black lace, her expression calm but watchful. "You don't have to prove anything to them," Tamsin murmured as the carriage slowed. "Let them prove themselves worthy of you." Genevieve offered a small, grateful smile, though her heart beat with apprehension. "I only want to pass unnoticed." Tamsin arched a delicate brow. "Then you should have worn grey muslin and a bonnet. Instead, you chose velvet and dignity. Let them look." The footman opened the door, and the world of Ashcroft spilled into view. Music drifting from the ballroom, laughter echoing from the grand staircase, jewels glittering beneath chandeliers like stars caught in crystal. Genevieve stepped out and felt the night change. Inside, the ballroom was a vision of opulence. Walls of ivory and gold towered toward a painted ceiling, where cherubs danced among clouds. Gas sconces glowed in every alcove, casting soft shadows over silk gowns and polished shoes. The orchestra, tucked beneath an arch of roses and holly, played a waltz that swept like a sigh through the air. Genevieve paused at the threshold. Conversations hushed just for a moment as eyes turned, not with disdain, but with curiosity. She was no longer the pale girl from a forgotten estate, no longer a guest hidden away in the east wing of a silent manor. She stood with quiet poise, her gaze steady, her presence undeniable. She moved through the room with Tamsin at her side, offering polite nods and brief smiles. Old names floated past her ear, lords and baronets, viscountesses and debutantes. Whispers began almost at once. "Who is she?" "Lady Fairlie's protégée, I believe." "No family, but that face." "She teaches languages, they say." "And who tailored that gown?" Each word fluttered like a moth toward flame. Genevieve walked through them untouched. Then, across the ballroom, she saw him, Julian Harwood. He stood near the marble hearth, dressed in formal black, his cravat fastened with a silver pin. The cut of his coat was severe, his posture straight, but his eyes, those steel-blue eyes, had lost none of their gravity. He was speaking to a member of Parliament, nodding slightly, but his gaze was no longer on the conversation. It was on her. Their eyes met. Time did not stop. It surged. Genevieve could feel the ballroom narrowing around them, the music becoming a hum in her veins, the light dimming to focus only on him. He looked older, harder somehow, as though the winter had carved itself into his expression. But there was something else. A flicker, unguarded, deep and unmistakable, recognition, shock, want. She did not look away. Lady Tamsin leaned close. "Are you quite all right?" Genevieve's voice was calm, though her pulse betrayed her. "Perfectly." Within moments, Julian began to move. The crowd parted for him, as though sensing the gravity of his direction, but before he could reach her, another figure intervened. Clarissa Ellingham. She stepped into view with the grace of a predator, her gown of jade silk clinging like ivy, her auburn hair twisted in gleaming ropes atop her head. Her smile was all teeth. "My dear Miss Merriweather," she purred. "How very enterprising of you." Genevieve regarded her with serene indifference. "Miss Ellingham." Clarissa's eyes raked her up and down, the envy thinly veiled behind a facade of cordiality. "One never quite knows where you'll surface next, does one? First in the countryside, then the gossip columns, now here, dripping in velvet no less." "London is generous to those who work," Genevieve replied softly. "Work," Clarissa repeated, voice lilting. "What an exhausting notion." Lady Tamsin's expression sharpened, but Genevieve lifted her chin slightly, and it was enough. Clarissa's smile faltered. "Shall we?" Genevieve murmured to Tamsin, and they turned before Clarissa could fashion another insult. But the whispers had already begun. Clarissa did not need to speak loudly for her venom to spread. Later, as the orchestra swelled into a Schubert waltz, Genevieve stood alone near the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers lightly touching the railing of the mezzanine. She watched couples swirl beneath the chandelier, colors blending, voices rising. "Miss Merriweather." Her breath caught. She turned. Julian stood before her, a single step above, his eyes shadowed but fixed on her with a force that unmoored everything. She dipped her head, her voice cool. "My lord." His reply was quiet. "You've changed." "I've grown," she answered. "That is not the same." He descended to stand beside her, the nearness making the air feel too thin. She could smell the faint scent of leather and pine on his coat, could feel the hum of his presence like an unfinished sentence. "Dance with me," he said, not as a command, but as something near a plea. She hesitated only a second. In the next moment, she was in his arms. The music enveloped them. He held her as though afraid she might vanish. His hand at her back was steady, yet careful. Her palm rested lightly in his, her breath shallow as they moved across the floor. They did not speak. Their eyes met, again and again. His gaze searched her face, as though trying to read all the words she had never spoken. She held herself still, but inside, the storm rose. On the final turn, his fingers tightened slightly, and she felt the shiver run through him. Then the music faded. Their hands parted slowly. She curtsied. He bowed. Before he could speak, she turned away. She moved through the crowd without looking back, her heart pounding with something wild and fragile. Lady Tamsin met her at the entrance, already prepared. "Ready?" Genevieve nodded once. The carriage was waiting, its door open like a quiet invitation to forget. As she stepped inside, the warmth of the velvet cushions could not banish the chill that had settled into her bones. Behind her, in the ballroom where light and shadows danced together, Julian Harwood stood alone. The waltz still echoed in her mind, but the silence that followed it said far more. The rain returned to Bath with a vengeance, as if the skies themselves sought to unearth what the earth had buried in silence for far too long. A low, steady downpour blanketed the city, turning cobblestones to glass and washing the streets clean of spring's fragile bloom. Stanwix House, perched like a sombre sentinel upon the hill, stood motionless in the storm, its windows shuttered, its chimneys silent, its corridors echoing with absence. Julian Harwood sat in the study of his family's solicitor, the walls around him lined with dusty ledgers and portraits of forgotten men who had once governed land and law with ink-stained fingers. The smell of old parchment and pipe smoke hung in the air. He sat with his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly before him, the tension in his jaw betraying the turmoil beneath his stillness. Across from him, Mr. Bartram, white-haired and thin, with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, flipped through a file marked Merryweather. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. "I must say, my lord," the solicitor said at last, "it is a matter that should have been addressed long ago." Julian's voice was low. "I wasn't aware there was a matter to address." Bartram's brow lifted. "That, I suspect, was by design." He slid a document across the desk. Julian leaned forward. The seal had been broken, but the script was unmistakably his father's, Lord Alfred Harwood, late Marquess of Stanwix, a man known for his pride, his secrecy, and his unyielding obsession with the family's name. "What is this?" Julian asked. "A memorandum," Bartram said, "dated 18 years ago. Your father approached Edward Merryweather, then a gentleman landowner of modest fortune, and sought his assistance in the matter of a financial irregularity." Julian's eyes narrowed. "What kind of irregularity?" Bartram hesitated. "Your brother, Lord Henry. There were debts, substantial ones, and a threat of legal action that would have drawn the Stanwix name through the courts. Scandal was a certainty." Julian closed his eyes briefly. "The details are all here," Bartram continued. "Your father sought Merryweather's discretion, and Merryweather provided it. He sold his estate, quietly, quickly, to settle the matter. The funds were routed through intermediaries so as not to raise suspicion. Your brother's name was cleared, the scandal averted." Julian's voice was a whisper. "And Merryweather lost everything." "Everything," Bartram confirmed. "His land, his position, his reputation, all quietly sacrificed. He retreated from society within a year, took his daughter with him." Genevieve. The name rose in Julian's mind like a wave crashing against stone. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the rug. "Why did no one tell me?" Bartram's expression softened with something approaching pity. "Your father was not a man who shared more than he deemed necessary. You were the heir. He protected you, and the truth, it did not serve his narrative." Julian's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the walls of the room pressing inward. The air felt heavier now, poisoned by knowledge withheld for too long. He left without another word. Back at Stanwick House, the storm continued to rage. The servants gave him a wide berth as he ascended the staircase, water dripping from his coat. He moved not to the east wing, nor to his chambers, but to the north corridor, the one rarely travelled, the one where the doors were kept locked, where dust gathered without disturbance. At the end of the hall stood the door, the one Genevieve had once passed, the one she had never dared to open, the one he had warned her against. The key, long forgotten, rested in a drawer in the library desk. He retrieved it with trembling fingers and returned to the corridor like a man walking toward a reckoning. The lock turned with a groan. The hinges protested. The door opened. Dust hung in the air like memory. The room was dark, lit only by the narrow light from the corridor. Julian stepped inside slowly, his boots brushing against the wood floor, his breath shallow. Stacks of boxes lined the far wall, their edges worn, their labels faded. A writing desk stood beneath a draped window, and upon it a single object, a silver-framed photograph of his father and Edward Merryweather, taken in brighter days. Both men wore expressions of solemn pride. There was trust in their posture, brotherhood in their gaze. Julian stared at it for a long time. Then, one by one, he opened the boxes. Deeds, letters, bank drafts, ledgers. One document bore his father's unmistakable signature, acknowledging the full repayment of an unnamed debt. Another, in Merryweather's hand, relinquishing ownership of his estate with the phrase, "in trust of the greater name." Julian sank into the chair beside the desk, his hands trembling. It was not merely guilt that filled him. It was grief. Grief for what had been done, for what had been taken, for the woman he had pushed away, blind to the very legacy that tied them together. Genevieve. She had arrived at his doorstep with nothing, and he had treated her as if she were a burden, an inconvenience, a temptation to be extinguished. But she had been the daughter of the man who saved him. Everything he had, his estate, his name, his unspoiled reputation, was built on the silent sacrifice of Edward Merryweather, and he had repaid that debt with silence, distance, and rejection. He stood abruptly, the photograph in his hand. "I have to find her," he murmured. That night, he gave orders to his valet, had the carriage readied by dawn. He left the estate before the sun had fully risen, the photograph tucked safely in his coat. The road to London was slick with rain, but he did not stop, not for food, not for rest. The journey blurred around him, hours folding into themselves like pages of a letter left unread for far too long. He arrived at Lady Tamsin Fairley's townhouse by twilight. The door opened, but Genevieve was gone. "She left yesterday morning," Tamsin said gently, her eyes unreadable, without explanation, only a note. She said she needed to go to find clarity. Julian's heart clenched. Did she leave an address? No. Tamsin studied him. But she left something else. She handed him a folded piece of parchment. The seal was unmarked. He broke it with shaking fingers. It was her handwriting. "Julian, you once said you could not be the reason I disappear. And now I must become the reason I am found. Do not seek me if your heart remains chained to honor over truth. I know who I am now. Do you? G." He read the words twice, 3 times, then folded the letter and placed it against his chest. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to break through, and somewhere in that endless city, Genevieve walked alone, but no longer unseen. And no longer owed. The first light of dawn spread across Bath, like a secret whispered to a waking city. A faint mist curled through the crescent streets, softening the edges of chimneys and the outlines of carriages preparing for the day. Beyond the town's stately terraces, the countryside stirred under the promise of early spring. Trees that had long stood in skeletal patience now bore the faintest haze of green, and even the air itself carried the scent of thawing earth. The carriage that brought Genevieve to the foot of Stanwick Hill rattled softly over the stones. She had chosen a modest one, without crest or livery, as though wishing to arrive unseen. Her gloved hands rested lightly on her reticule, her eyes fixed on the familiar rise of the estate ahead. She had not written, had not announced herself. She came as a pilgrim comes to a shrine, uninvited but compelled. Stanwick House emerged through the veil of mist like a memory given shape. The ivy on its walls was no longer black and brittle, but stippled with new shoots, and the long windows caught the pale light with a glimmer rather than a glare. Yet even softened by the season, the house loomed, dignified and remote, a place of echoes. The driver dismounted and set her trunk down at the edge of the gravel. Genevieve stepped out carefully, the hem of her travelling gown brushing damp stone. She had chosen a dress of deep blue wool trimmed with velvet, practical for travel, but cut with a grace that mirrored her quiet transformation. Her bonnet, structured and modest, bore only a spray of faux violets at its brim. She looked neither like the dependent who had arrived months before, nor like the mysterious guest at Ashcroft House. She looked like herself, composed, resolute, and whole. No servant met her at the door. The knocker, when she lifted it, felt colder than she remembered. She did not use it. Instead, she turned away from the entrance and followed the path around the side of the house toward the garden. Her boots sank slightly into the damp earth where the gravel ended, and the air grew softer with the scent of soil and budding leaves. The winter garden had changed. Where once the rose bushes had been brittle and grey, now small red buds pressed from their thorns. The grass, though still thin, showed strokes of green. In the far corner, the fig tree under which she had once sat in silence had begun to unfurl its first shy leaves. Birds flickered from branch to branch, their calls tentative, as if testing the world's readiness for song. Genevieve walked slowly along the path, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of a hedgerow. She remembered how it had been. The snow pressed against the conservatory panes, the hush of a storm, the ache of words unspoken. She had come here not for that memory, but for its opposite, closure, clarity, and the courage to stand where she had once stood small. Behind her, footsteps crunched on gravel. She turned. Julian Harwood stood at the end of the path, the morning light breaking over his shoulder. He was without coat or hat, dressed simply in a dark waistcoat and linen shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to reveal strong, veined wrists. His hair, no longer perfectly ordered, fell in a slight wave across his forehead. The change in season had not erased the lines of gravity from his face, but there was something different in his eyes, less guarded, more human. They stared at one another across the garden, and for a moment neither moved. The mist between them drifted like a living thing, carrying the ghosts of all that had passed. "Genevieve," he said at last, his voice low and unsteady. "You're here." She inclined her head. "I am. Why?" Her gaze flicked to the hedges, then back to him. To stand in the place where everything began, to find an ending or a beginning. He took a step toward her, then another, until the space between them narrowed to a few strides. "I did not expect you. I did not plan to be expected," she replied softly. He stopped a pace away, his hands at his sides. "I have things to tell you." She folded her gloves together, her pulse a quiet drum. "Then tell me." Julian's eyes closed briefly, as though drawing breath not just into his lungs, but into his courage. When he opened them, the mist of restraint that had long shadowed his expression had thinned. "I wronged you," he began, his voice low but clear. "Not only in sending you away, not only in believing you would be better without me. I wronged you before you even stepped through this gate." Genevieve said nothing, but her fingers tightened on the gloves. "I learned the truth after you left," he continued. The locked room in this house, the one I forbade you to enter, it held the records of my family's greatest shame. Your father, Edward Merriweather, sacrificed everything to protect the Stanwyck name. He sold his estate, his reputation, his future, to shield us from scandal. He saved my brother from ruin, and my father let him vanish into obscurity. He let him take the blame. And I, blind and arrogant, inherited all of it without knowing the cost. The words fell like stones into water. Genevieve's breath caught, but she remained still. Julian stepped closer, his voice roughened. Everything I own, every wall you have walked past, every meal you were served here, it all stands on what was taken from him, from you. And I treated you as though you were an inconvenience to be hidden, when in truth, you were the daughter of the man who saved me. He stopped, his hands curling briefly, then loosening. I cannot give you back what was lost. I cannot erase what I have been. But I can tell you this. His eyes met hers with a steadiness that was almost painful. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking for your hand. I am not asking for anything at all but the chance to tell you the truth and to offer you, for the first time, something untainted by duty or debt. Genevieve's throat tightened. And what is that? He exhaled, a sound between a breath and a vow. My heart. Only that. Only ever that. Silence settled over the garden, heavy and fragile. The morning light brightened, glinting off a drop of water trembling at the tip of a rosebud. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and something just beginning to bloom. Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. She saw not the Marquess, not the man who had sent her away, but the boy who had once stood in a locked room while the truth was buried beneath ledgers and silence. She saw the cost etched in his face, the humility in his stance, the quiet plea in his eyes despite the absence of words. Slowly, she stepped toward him. One pace, then another, until she stood before him, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty cross his expression, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him through the cool morning air. Her gloved hand lifted. She did not take his hand nor his arm. Instead, she rested her palm lightly against his chest, above the steady beat of his heart. I am not here to reclaim anything, she said softly. Not land, not status, not even the past. I am here because I know who I am now, and I will not be diminished again. His breath caught beneath her touch. Genevieve, you do not have to beg, she interrupted gently. You do not have to offer me a title or a fortune. I will not be bought. But if you are truly offering your heart, then know this, I am no longer a girl at your threshold. I stand as your equal, and I step forward because I choose to. For a moment his eyes closed. When they opened, the sheen of unshed tears glimmered there, making the steel blue softer, deeper. He did not speak. He only reached up slowly, as if fearing she might vanish, and laid his hand over hers where it rested against his chest. Their eyes held, and in that silent exchange lay all the words they had left unsaid. The wind stirred the branches above them, sending a small shower of droplets to the path at their feet. A bird broke into tentative song, somewhere in the hedge, its notes clear and trembling. Genevieve felt her own heartbeat steady against his. She had come for closure. She had found something far greater. Not a plea, not an apology, a choice. She stepped closer, closing the last space between them, and for the first time since she had known him, Julian Harwood did not retreat. The bells of Bath rang soft that morning, their chimes echoing across the hills and settling gently over the stone rooftops like a benediction. It was neither a grand holiday nor a public celebration. Yet for those who knew, for those who listened closely, something in the air had changed. Inside Stanwyck House, the hush was not of sorrow or reserve, but of reverence. No guests filled the drawing room. No announcements were made in the society pages. No silken trains swept through the halls, no choir sang beneath stained glass. Yet in the heart of the house, within a modest parlour warmed by morning light and a single vase of early blooms, Julian Harwood and Genevieve Merriweather pledged their lives to one another in quiet, unshakable devotion. No titles were exchanged, no debts settled, no elaborate oaths whispered for appearances. Only truth remained. Genevieve wore a gown of ivory muslin, trimmed with pale lavender satin. Simple, yet elegant in its lines, it was chosen not to dazzle but to reflect who she had become, a woman shaped by pain, refined by dignity, and defined not by society, but by her own sense of worth. Her dark hair was coiled in soft spirals at the nape of her neck, secured with a silver pin once belonging to her mother. A single sprig of myrtle, fresh from the garden, was tucked into the side. She walked without veil, without fanfare, only her calm breath and unguarded eyes as her compass. Julian stood waiting near the hearth, dressed in a dark frock coat with a white cravat and no insignia of rank. The man who had once cloaked himself in detachment now looked openly, steadily, lovingly at the woman approaching him. Not as a possession, not as an obligation, but as an equal soul come home. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by Lady Tamsin Fairley and Reverend Bellamy, an elderly clergyman who had known Julian's mother in her youth. There were no gasps, no swoons, no stifled protests, only quiet words spoken with unshaking voices, and a pause so heavy with meaning that even the Reverend's hands trembled slightly when he said the final blessing. When it was done, they did not kiss in spectacle. Genevieve met Julian's gaze, her lips parted in a breathless smile that held more passion than any public embrace. He lifted her hand to his lips, not out of habit or propriety, but in a gesture that made the room itself seem to still. They were husband and wife, yes, but more than that, they were partners, chosen freely in the face of all they had endured. That afternoon, the transformation of the locked room began. The door, once shrouded in silence and sealed by guilt, was opened wide. Gone were the dust-covered ledgers and cold shelves lined with relics of secrecy. In their place came warmth and purpose. Genevieve's hands directed each change, slowly, deliberately. She chose wooden desks built low enough for young elbows to rest upon without strain, shelves filled with well-loved books, globes, slates, and a small harp in the corner that had once belonged to Julian's mother. Light filtered through tall windows, where heavy drapes had been replaced with linen curtains that danced in the breeze. On one wall she hung a portrait of her father, painted not in oil or grandeur, but sketched in charcoal by a gifted student from London who owed her a kindness. Beneath the portrait she placed a brass plaque that read simply, "For those who gave all and were never named." And then came the girls. One by one they arrived, daughters of the overlooked, the widowed, the quiet seamstresses and aging governesses who had once been forgotten by society's glittering gaze. They came with notebooks clasped tightly to their chests and shoes worn thin by miles walked. But here, within these walls, they found not charity, but dignity. They found a woman who saw them not as burdens, but as bearers of promise. Genevieve taught them letters and numbers, certainly, but also history, poetry, composition, and self-respect. Julian, too, found a new rhythm. While she instructed, he tended to estate affairs with clarity and fairness that surprised those who had once called him aloof. His hand in Genevieve's work was invisible but steadfast. Scholarships funded quietly, guardianship ensured discreetly, structures repaired swiftly. He no longer ruled his home from a distance. He walked through it, sleeves rolled, voice low, presence steady. And each evening, just as the sun dipped below the hills of Bath and the last notes of a lesson faded into twilight, he would wait for her in the garden. The garden had awakened in full by then, no longer budding but bursting with bloom. Roses unfolded in defiant reds and soft creams, vines climbed joyfully across the trellises, and the fig tree cast dappled shadows over a bench now worn by two. The air was alive with scent, with bees, with laughter that sometimes slipped like music from the open schoolroom windows. It was there, beneath a canopy of blossoms, that Julian kissed Genevieve once more. Not as a farewell, not as a promise withheld, but as the culmination of all that had passed between them. His hands framed her face with reverence, not possession. His mouth met hers in a union not of apology, but of gratitude. It was not their first kiss, nor would it be their last, but it was the one they would both remember until their final days. The kiss of equals, the kiss of a vow lived. Clarissa Ellingham, once so vivid in her scheming, vanished slowly from the narrative of their lives. Her name, whispered in passing, became a cautionary echo. Her bitterness, once sharp as vinegar, faded like perfume left uncorked. She retreated into lesser drawing rooms and colder receptions, her ambition undermined by its own hollowness. When she did appear in Bath again, her presence passed like a shadow on a bright wall, acknowledged, but no longer feared. And as for the whispers, those that once followed Genevieve with pity, with ridicule, with suspicion, they too transformed. The women of Bath, particularly those who had once turned their eyes away, began to turn them toward her, not with gossip, but with respect. They spoke in hushed admiration of the school, of the way she walked beside her husband, with grace but without subservience, of the way her voice carried both softness and steel when she advocated for the unseen. The whispers became praise, and then, in time, they became legacy. On the first anniversary of their quiet wedding, Genevieve stood before a new group of girls, 10 in total, seated at their desks with ink-stained fingers and hopeful eyes. Julian entered at the back of the room and leaned quietly against the doorframe, arms folded. She did not turn when she saw him, but her smile deepened and the light in her voice grew more golden. Outside, the garden hummed with life. And as the clock struck the hour and the class dismissed, Genevieve stepped into the sunlight where her husband waited and took his hand as she always had. Not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him. In that small moment, beneath the arch of vines and the ever-blooming roses, Julian kissed her once again, not with apology, not with passion stolen in haste, but with reverence, with love earned, with the quiet triumph of two souls who had found one another not despite the world's cruelties, but through them. The garden bloomed early that year. It was a spring so gentle, so unhurried, that it seemed nature itself had grown contemplative with age. The roses at Stanwick House unfolded in soft succession, first the pale blush, then the cream, then the rebellious crimson, each petal a reminder of seasons endured and survived. The fig tree had grown thick and wise, its branches arching protectively over the bench where two lovers once sought solace and found something more enduring than passion, peace. 8 years had passed since Genevieve had stepped through those gates, not as a guest nor as a ward, but as mistress, teacher, wife. She stood now at the edge of the garden path, her hands folded lightly over a linen apron, smudged with ink and chalk. Time had etched a quiet glow into her features. Her beauty had not faded, it had matured. There were fine lines near her eyes now, born of laughter and long nights comforting a feverish child. There was silver at her temples that caught the sunlight and wore it like a crown. She no longer measured herself by society's gaze. She was measured in roots, in pages turned, in names called out at the door with muddy boots and beaming faces. A shout rang through the air. "Mama!" 2 figures burst into view, racing along the path. Amelia, 7, with her father's steady gaze and her mother's wild curls, and Thomas, 5, trailing behind with a wooden sword in one hand and a daisy crown in the other. They collided against her legs with the force of thunder wrapped in cotton, and Genevieve laughed, her arms circling them with practiced ease. Behind them, Julian walked slowly, his stride still proud but tempered by the aches of a man who had once carried the weight of shame like armor. His hair was threaded with grey now, and he bore a slight limp from a fall during last winter's hunt, but his eyes, those grey eyes that once withheld everything, had softened into something infinitely more dangerous: tenderness. He watched her with the same reverence as the day he had first kissed her among these blooms, as if every moment with her had been borrowed from a more generous world. She caught his gaze over their children's heads and smiled, that knowing, quiet smile that only two people who had truly earned one another could share. He came to her side, slipped an arm around her waist, and kissed her temple. "The housekeeper says Lady Tamsin is arriving tomorrow," he murmured. "She insists on bringing a new globe for the schoolroom." Genevieve chuckled. "That will make 3. But the girls still argue over who gets to spin it." Their school had grown, as had the respect it commanded. Once limited to a handful of overlooked daughters, it now educated nearly 30 girls each season, some orphans, some from struggling families, and some quietly sponsored by mothers who had once dismissed Genevieve as scandalous. The locked room that had once housed secrets and debts was now covered in drawings, stitched samplers, maps, and essays. It no longer bore the weight of shame, it sang with learning. Clarissa Ellingham had not returned to Bath. After years of bitterness and failed ambitions, she had married a distant cousin in Sussex, a man with a title and no fortune, who preferred horses to conversation. Rumour had it she lived now in a damp estate, attended by servants she could barely afford, and visited by no one but creditors. She had faded into irrelevance, not by cruelty, but by her own hand. Her letters to Julian, once sharp with contempt, had ceased altogether after the birth of Amelia. There had been no need for reply. Genevieve still visited her father's resting place once a year, with Julian and the children beside her. They placed violets at the base of his modest stone and read aloud passages from his favourite plays. One year, Amelia had whispered, "Thank you for Mama," and Julian had quietly wept behind a handkerchief embroidered with his wife's initials. Bath, too, had changed, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but it had changed. Widows and tradeswomen now sat beside baronesses at charity boards. A scholarship fund in Genevieve's name supported a small cohort of young female scholars at the Bath Academy. Men who had once sneered now tipped their hats when she passed, and girls who had once walked with heads bowed now stood in public recitations with their voices strong and their hearts sure of their worth. One of those girls had recently been accepted to study medicine in Edinburgh, a scandalous triumph, and one that Julian had toasted with champagne. On the eve of their 10th wedding anniversary, Genevieve had opened a drawer and found a small yellowed envelope she had never had the heart to discard. The letter from Lady Tamsin that had once summoned her to London, the hinge that had turned the door of her life. She had read it again that night by the fire, while Julian slept with a child curled beneath each arm. At the bottom of the page, in fading ink, were the words, "Your father gave all so you could choose your own fate. Do not waste it by seeking someone else's blessing." She had not wasted it, she had reclaimed it. And now, as the garden burst again into life, as her children raced with unshackled joy, and her husband's hand found hers once more, Genevieve closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of honeysuckle and earth. The past had not vanished. It had been woven into the very fabric of this peace. Pain, sacrifice, longing, shame, desire, all of it lived here. But so did forgiveness, so did love, so did the future. And in the hush of late afternoon, as laughter rippled like wind through the fig leaves, Genevieve knew that time had not dulled their love, it had made it eternal. Some stories are not made of grand gestures or perfect beginnings. Some are woven from silence, glances, sacrifices, and words left unspoken until the heart is ready to speak. Genevieve and Julian's journey reminds us that love, true love, is not always found where society tells us to look. It is not owed, nor earned by beauty, nor bought with titles. It is chosen day by day by two people brave enough to face their past, forgive it, and walk forward, side by side. Through heartbreak, duty, shame, and redemption, Genevieve discovered not just the love of a man, but the strength of a woman who would no longer be defined by silence or scandal. And in doing so, she reclaimed her voice, not just for herself, but for others who had never been seen. If this story touched you, if it moved something quiet inside your heart, we would love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments. What part of their journey stayed with you the most? And if you made it all the way to this final moment, write the word reclaimed in the comments so we'll know you felt every beat of this story until the very end. Let's fill this space with echoes of love that endures. If you believe in the power of stories like this one and wish to help us continue bringing them to life, consider leaving a super thanks with whatever amount feels right for you. Your support helps us keep these timeless romances alive, one chapter at a time. And if you're not able to contribute financially, sharing this story with a friend or loved one is a beautiful way to help us reach more hearts. There are more tales waiting for you, full of longing, courage, and love that defies expectation. Check the cards at the top of the screen for more unforgettable historical romances. Thank you for believing in stories where women rise, love is earned, and hearts bloom again, even after winter.